Good morning, everyone. Before John begins his class, I just want to make an announcement that the Learning and Retirement Board decided yesterday that as of April, we are going back to in-person meetings on our monthly meetings. So April meeting will be back at Grace United Methodist Church. We are altering the format slightly. We will start gathering at 10. The program will be the usual 10:30 to 11:30. There will be no refreshments, but you're welcome to bring your own mug of coffee or whatever if you so choose. So that's the latest update, and I'll turn it over to John.
Thank you, Gary. Welcome to all of you. It's great to see old faces and old friends. I use that term advisedly. I'm looking at you, Larry. And old friends and folks that I've seen some of these courses before. So that's always gratifying. And I appreciate all of you, particularly those of you that have heard me before and came back again anyway. I've got a few logistical things that I want to take care of just for housekeeping. The course is announced, as you know, for 2 hours, 9:30 to 11:30. I'll guarantee you we're going to start on time. The Zoom audience will be out there, and we'll need to be starting just pretty close to on time, if not exactly. I won't guarantee you necessarily that we will absolutely go up to 11:30 as though I absolutely have got to fill up that 2-hour slot that I have been given. I think you can expect that we'll go till we get done. And I think I'll know when we're done because I'm going to save time for Q&A at the end, comments. Make notes on those handouts. If you want to come back to anything, we can surely do those. I would like to go straight through unless you have something that's really bugging you about something I've just said, for the benefit of the second section of the class, which is out there in Zoom land somewhere. I think it just works more smoothly that way, but I'll guarantee you we will be here until the Q&A and comments are over, and we'll go out the door when we get done with that. We've got 2 executive officials, the former president and current president of the Learning and Retirement Group here. I don't think they would mind giving you your money back if you don't appreciate that. But mostly, I think you'll agree that we have adequately covered that day. And in that vein, I want to say, make yourself comfortable. If you're like me, I've gotten to the point where I can sit for about an hour and then I had to go stand up somewhere. So if you have that malady and need to go stand up somewhere or get a drink of water at the fountain over there, feel free. I've taught a long time at SIU, and there's not much I haven't seen right in the middle of class, and I'm not easily distracted, so you won't bother me at all, whatever you need to do. I don't have to tell the people in the Zoom land out there, they're going to get up and go and do what they want to. The only exception to that rule I'd have to say is cell phones. If you haven't checked your cell phone, those do tend to be a little distracting. So please put them on mute and turn the cell phones off. Each time we will have hard copy, and my 2 high-paid assistants have already put out the hard copies, and we will have the stuff that's going out on television via the Zoom for them, and it will be in hard copy for you each week. So you can look forward to taking home a lot of paper. I want to start today with sort of setting the historical and conceptual and theoretical setting. And I think, frankly, I'm a little worried about this one today because I think it's more theoretical and more conceptual than you're used to hearing from me. We will get to sort of the practical politics pretty quickly, and I know you expect at least some of that sort of thing, including polling and that sort of thing. But this this may border on the pedantic, but it won't all be like that. I still feel the need to set sort of a theoretical context. If you have suggestions about either the logistics or what you see on the syllabus, want something added, or if you want to talk about something in the question and answer section that didn't come up before, this is course in politics. And if you're concerned about something that are headline values for today, we can talk about that. So don't hesitate to bring up things that interest you, and don't hesitate to get in touch with me by email or here in this context for those of you that are here to let me know that you're thinking that something might work better in some other format. So with all of that, by way of launching out, I'll stop here for just a minute. The exception to that rule is that all okay? Anybody see anything that's going to be a bother to them yet? So far, so good. Okay. I want to start with sort of the context in which I developed this course, and I presented it to the Learning and Retirement Committee and the board there that have to approve these courses. That title is Democracy in Peril in America Today: Polarization, the Primaries, and the Polls. And in about January, I wrote a proposal to that group suggesting this course. And the synopsis that I provided to them, I want to just read it to you and let you know exactly what I said to them. And you have that as slide number 1 and handout number 1. So I know you can read, but I do want to read this verbatim to set the stage. It says, public intellectuals, the pundits, and serious political leaders have insistently been raising fundamental questions about the continued viability of American democracy. Parenthetically, I hope that's what we're going to struggle with and talk about constantly. The leaders of our competitive nations, China and Russia, insist that the American system no longer works and that their model of authoritarian leadership dominated by one party is the wave of the 21st century. Now, I could not possibly have anticipated in January just how relevant that has become with the headline values of the last 3 weeks. It's amazing to me, all of that stuff that has happened that is absolutely unprecedented in my view, and we can certainly work that discussion in. But nevertheless, China and Russia and their leadership have consistently challenged American democracies and democracy in general, and they have consistently offered their one-party authoritarian rule as the better alternative. President Biden insists that the American model of separation of powers and checks and balances devised in the 1790s can still work, but he faces deep divisions in Congress, the nation as a whole, which constantly challenge his ability to get things done, his ability to govern, as the term goes. These are profound issues surrounding mass democracy in the era of party realignment and deep polarization. We're going to talk a lot about those 2 topics, party realignment and deep political polarization. So all of this will provide the context in which the current, this spring and summer, party primaries are going to play out, and we'll talk about those a little later, including here in Illinois, because we of course have a primary coming up in June. So all of that will be happening very shortly in other states during, and in our case, fairly soon after this course ends. The public opinion polls provide rich sources of information about the people's support of democratic institutions and their basic understanding of American democracy and its practical requirements. Unfortunately, everybody thinks they understand democracy, but they don't always understand the practical implications of what that means. These fundamental issues will constitute the backdrop for both the intra-party fights in the primaries and the run-up to the critical midterm elections that are coming in the fall. Again, the context is very much pointing toward those fall midterm elections, which will be absolutely crucial elections. They're always important. They're maybe more important this year than any time in recent memories. This course will set the stage and define the stakes for the fall campaigns and elections. Now, today's lecture is entitled The Setting or the Context, the Historic Context. And I'm going to start that mostly with the 2020 presidential campaign and election, and particularly because that campaign still is with us today. It hadn't gone away. It's more than a year later, and the conditions of the midterm campaigns and elections are now set on the fundamental backdrop of that 2020 campaign and election, which I think is unprecedented in the fact that it's still so much still with us today. Usually it's gone away, and 2 years later, midterm elections, mostly all over. It's not all over. And so that indicates these are not normal times in American politics. The current context, I think, is sort of the culmination of a lot of macro level trends, and they've been building for all of the 21st century. And if I would go back to the 20th century, I would say building in all of our adult lifetime from the 60s on through 2000. Those trends were set in place then. And even more fundamentally, if you're a historian and maybe not a political scientist, back to the Civil War. And if you're a constitutional law scholar, back to the structure of the Constitution. So we're back to the 1790s already. So not surprisingly, the stress has come from a lot of built up pressure, and that stress is now upon us. The November elections weren't over in any sense on November the 6th. So we're going to go back and cover that period from November 6th through January the 6th and the aftermath of all that happened on January the 6th. All of that too, not only will be the backdrop for the midterm elections coming this fall, but it's absolutely a part of the context that will still be here in 2024. So my concluding thought from that is the election of 2024 is now upon us, ladies and gentlemen. I give you that cheerful thought for starting your day. Maybe you don't want to think about that at this point.
No.
For the context also, spring of 2020, March the 17th, was the day SIU closed and sent everybody home and said, go home, don't come back. Put everybody that was still there in classes in special circumstance. All of you know about that, or you have children and grandchildren who were somewhere else where that happened to them at almost exactly that same time. People went home to work and study and go through the first grade or go through graduate programs or whatever, almost entirely by remote and by Zoom or whatever else was available at the time. And that's because, of course, the pandemic started really seriously on all of us almost exactly 2 years ago. It's amazing in some ways that it's been 2 years. On the other hand, it seems like it's been forever, particularly being able to get together in these kind of settings because we've all had to get together in Zoom land. And a lot of us have grown very tired of that. The American people have grown very tired of that. March the 17th, not long after that, May the 25th, Memorial Day, Michael Brown died on the streets of Minneapolis at the knee of a police officer, while 3 other police officers stood by and a small crowd gathered. That started the unprecedented level of a new era of civil rights movement, civil rights demonstrations. all kinds of things that happened immediately upon the death of Michael Brown. The start of Black Lives Matter movement. I think it actually existed before then, but it certainly got a new impetus. Demonstrations in major American cities across the country, and interestingly enough, demonstrations in places like Carbondale and Anna, who would have thunk it, and all kinds of even small towns had demonstrations about the treatment of African Americans in this country, and to some extent organized, but not really terribly organized by the Black Lives Matter movement. And those demonstrations fairly quickly got out of hand in particularly some of the big cities, especially Chicago, for example. That led to burning, looting, aftermath of those kinds of things that we were all familiar with going back to 1968, at least, when Detroit and all of that in that explosive summer of 1968. I remember it vividly. Nancy and I lived in Ann Arbor, Michigan that year, and Detroit was burned downtown, and we were living not very far away. And you can all think of where you were in 68, and some of it had certainly started before then. All of that's going to be very much with us, because that's going to be a theme that is prominent in national campaigns and is already prominent in Illinois campaigns. The Republicans, for example, have adopted the theme of crime and criminal justice reform, and the advocacy for totally revamping our revising and even perhaps overturning the very large criminal justice bill that the Democrats put through the Illinois General Assembly just last year. I don't know if you've been watching enough television to have seen Mayor Irvin's campaign ads, but they seem to be everywhere already. And he's running very much on that theme and what he did in Aurora to get the genie back in the bottle. And you're getting the taste of what every campaign, from governor down to county board, down to all kinds of very small elections, state rep, state senate, they're all going to run that particular commercial in some form. And that fight over crime and its roots and who caused it and who didn't do something, who did something. Those are going to be the themes that you're going to see played out, both in the primaries, but most notably in the general election. And the question being asked there is, how will that play in the suburbs? Because that's going to be the key issue, whether it's in Illinois or whether it's nationally. And even among frightened and fed up voters in downtown Chicago, for example, that are tired of the violence they saw spill over down into the Loop, that are frightened by some of the looting and burning downtown on the Magic Mile, the Magnificent Mile. All of that's going to be important and a part of Illinois politics in this next election. And that in many ways is just a continuation of what happened in especially the fall of 2020. Donald Trump ran on that theme. He declared that he was the law and order candidate. He recognized the longstanding problems there and that they were a gold mine to be mined, and he went after it. He went after Seattle and Portland and all of those places, Chicago fairly often, where there had been this kind of violence. And that question of race hangs over everything in American elections. And it really, I thought at one point in my life that it might go away or at least get tamped down. But if anything, it's come back with a vengeance. I think all of you are of an age that you will remember Richard Nixon, 1968. He ran on Lee Atwater's term, Law and Order, and he was the law and order candidate. And I was taken back to 1968 when I watched some of those ads in the 2020 presidential campaign. So, pandemic, number one, race relations, number two. Some of you will remember in fall of 2020, I taught a Zoom section of this particular course for those of you that were there, and you'll remember those were the two themes that we worked out as the backdrop of that election. And again, instead of that going away, if anything, it's intensified now 2 years later. Beyond the campaign and election itself, we voted on November 3rd, but as I mentioned, it still hasn't gone away, and the aftermath of it is still with us. And I think that is almost unprecedented. In fact, I would say it is precedented because we had a sitting president who refused to say that he had lost the election. And Donald Trump still maintains that the election was stolen and that it was stolen through vote fraud. He refused to say before the campaign, before the election, during the campaign, that he would abide by the outcome of the vote, and said it again and again out there on campaign trail. And so it shouldn't have been a surprise, really, that he refused, for example, to concede the election. He said he had clearly won the election and that the early vote proved that. Actually, the early vote was very, very close in the early hours, and there's very good reason for that. Depending on where the early vote came in from, everybody knew that the early vote was going to be strongly Republican because of the way the ballots were cast, in person versus absentee. We could go back to all of that, but it had a kind of a quality of face validity to it. His people believed that because it was indeed fairly close, particularly in those swing states of Georgia, Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Wisconsin, and especially with the vote coming in late, as they always do, from the big cities like Atlanta, Philadelphia, Phoenix, Madison, and Milwaukee. So that contingent is still very much with us. So he said, we're going to continue the fight. We're going to file legal challenges in those key states. And his team went out and filed those legal challenges. Trump won the narrative on that, at least with his followers, but he did not win the legal fight. I think it's worth noting right here at the outset, there were slightly more than 60 formal legal challenges filed. He won one on a procedural matter. He lost all the rest. And some of those losses were in front of the Supreme Court of the United States, where he had just put 3 of his justices. It must have been a huge disappointment to the then President Trump that he didn't get a hearing before the Supreme Court. And when they made a ruling, every single one of the Supreme Court rulings went against him. But the narrative continues, and he has won, at least with an enormous number of the American people on that narrative. Biden went about his business trying to form a new administration, at first getting all kinds of problems forming that new administration, but he finally did, and he treated it as he had won, and so he went about things as usual. The president, or president then, former President Trump, also took his fight to the state capitals, and there the question was the counting of the Electoral College vote, the certification of that vote by the authorities in those states. And of course, it varies somewhat in the states. And that's where they focused their attention, as well as what Trump was doing nationally. All of this culminated in January 6th, 2021. Trump supporters gathered on the south side of the White House down there. Many of you have been there, probably all of you have been there at one time or another. I could just sort of see that place in my mind when I was watching it on television. He got up on that stage and said, we have to stop the steal. And that was the theme of the day. And that's what was on all of those signs. And you'll remember that memorable line has been on television 1,000 times, where he said, we have to fight like hell to see that this is not going to stand. And then he invited them to march up to Capitol Hill and to take back the election. I have actually walked from there to Capitol Hill. It's about 2 miles, and it's not that tough of a walk, or at least when I did do that walk. And they just disbanded, went up to Capitol Hill, and we had what we've all seen on television. What started out as a demonstration, I don't know how peaceful the intent was, but you will remember serious violence accrued right there very quickly on the outside of the Capitol and then on the inside of the Capitol. And one of the persons in the demonstration got killed, of all things, at the door of the House floor, which is just amazing when you think about it. I worked up there for a short time, and I still have a hard time believing that somebody did all of that to the Capitol where I once worked and could even get in, much less do all of the damage and all the things that went on. And as you know, there were 4 Capitol policemen very quickly died as a direct or indirect result of that particular melee that went on that day. Now, let me get you to do a mind game for just a moment. Think about the counterfactual hypothetical. What would have happened if Trump and his supporters had prevailed at that point? What would have happened if the Electoral College vote had been stopped or had been changed from that which came up from each of the 50 states? What would have happened immediately in the aftermath of that? I would maintain we would have had a serious constitutional crisis. And I would tell you, we only narrowly averted a constitutional crisis as it was. And there would have been chaos in the Capitol. There would have been chaos on the streets of Washington, and I would say on the streets of a lot of American cities. It was 3 a.m. in the morning after all that had happened. The Congress went back into session, looked over the official vote, which some cool thinking employee had salvaged all those boxes and carried those out and then brought them back. And they voted to accept the results and declare Joe Biden the next president of the United States. Interestingly enough, and I think this will be one of those great ironies and interests of American history, the hero of the day was clearly Vice President Mike Pence. Trump had leaned on him and told him in public and told him in private over and over again not to accept those results, that he had to vote to accept the alternative electors or throw the whole thing back to the state legislators and let them send up the results again. Trump picked Pence because he knew Pence would be a loyal second in command. And nobody could have been more loyal than Mike Pence. He never said a discouraging word. He never had a frown on his face when the president was speaking. He had amazing stamina in my estimation. And I'm sure Trump thought there was no way Mike Pence was going to defy him. In 4 years, Mike Pence had done exactly what Donald Trump told him to do. So imagine his disappointment when Mike Pence said, I'm going to do what the Constitution requires. Deep down inside, Mike Pence's loyalty was to the Constitution before his loyalty to Donald Trump. And that absolutely saved us. It would have been a disaster. And for those Hoosiers among us, Dan Quayle was consulted several times by Mike Pence. I had a minimal high regard for Mike Quayle, for Dan Quayle when he was vice president, but I take off my hat. He steeled Vice President Pence's backbone. 2 Hoosiers get together and talk 3 or 4 times, and Quayle told him to do the right thing, follow the Constitution. You're simply a clerk. You've got to do what Constitution requires, and there is no mystery about it. So hats off to those two guys from Indiana. In some ways, more surprisingly, the Congress did its duty, as deeply divided as the Congress was. It certified the results. But I put an asterisk there. There were 147 Republicans in the House who voted not to certify the results. And those included every member of the leadership team except for Liz Cheney. But nevertheless, the constitutional crisis, legally at least, went away. Counterfactual, though. Think about what a mess it would have been otherwise. We would still be brawling over it. Politically, however, the fight lingers on. I want to add one other hero to the lexicon here, and that's General Mark Milley, who's chair of Joint Chiefs of Staff. He played an absolutely key role. I have a friend here locally that I go to church with, and he asked me the weekend before that if we were going to have a coup, and I said, no, we're not going to have a coup because the military won't do it. And you can't have a coup without the American military. And those flag officers out there at the Pentagon will do what the Constitution requires. And Mark Milley made my prediction a good one because he did the right thing. Parenthetically, he had learned his lesson from the walk across Lafayette Park to the church. He showed up at that one in his fatigues, but that's another footnote to history. The fight goes on. And we have never had that since 1800. I've taught this 100 times in both my parties classes, my intro to American government classes. You have to remember the election of 1800 because it was the first time we ever had the peaceful transfer of power from one party to another, from the Washington Adams Federalists to the Jeffersonians, and to John Adams gave the reins of power to Thomas Jefferson. And that set the precedent, and we've never failed to meet that precedent from 1800 through 2020. And that's how unprecedented this whole situation is. And many races for Congress in these primaries are shaping up as a referendum on what happened on January the 6th and what happened that didn't go the way one side wanted it, and which side are you on? And that is dividing many Republican primaries even today in congressional and Senate races. And it's still very much with us at the national level. The question is, can we figure out a way to get back to expecting the norm of the peaceful transfer of power? And that's what's at stake in the state midterm elections and these congressional and Senate elections that are coming up in the fall. And beyond the electoral outcome, once you get into office, as Joe Biden did, can you govern? Do you have enough support? Do you have enough elite level support, public opinion support, voter level support to be able to enact the policies that you're trying to put into place? Our adversaries, particularly the Russians and the Chinese, say we can't do that. That the president and the Congress and the courts, particularly the president and the Congress, can't get along well enough. They can't get on the same page well enough to get things done to let us rise to meet the challenges of the 21st century. And those challenges just got way worse in the last 3 weeks. And they're being listened to all over the world, in the less developed world, in the Middle East, for example, in Latin America, in Africa, where they're choosing what kind of government they want and whether they want to follow our model or follow the one-party model and go that really authoritarian route. So many people think we have a crisis of democracy that's important not only to this nation, but also to the rest of the world, simply because of that model that we are and how much we're looked up to by the rest of the world. But if our government's dysfunctional, if it can't work, then why should they go that route? And that's what people, the authoritarians, are asking. Gary, if we could move now to slide 2, and if you want to shift gears on your handout, I finally made it that very long introduction to slide 2, New York Times article, February the 27th. Title of that article says it all. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is yet more bad news for the world's democracies. The introduction to the articles was that particular phrase, and then I continued. Democracy has been on the decline worldwide for more than 15 years, most of the 21st century. One major reason is the growing ruthlessness of authoritarian leaders, particularly Russian President Vladimir Putin. Putin has spent more than 2 decades consolidating power, rebuilding Russia's military, and weakening his enemies. The invasion of Ukraine, the largest war in Europe since World War II, is a significant escalation of this behavior. The country's fall would mark a violent end to one of the world's democracies. Just 1 in 5 people now live in countries designated as free, down from nearly 1 in 2 in 2005, a new report from the Freedom House has found. So that's what I noted in the introduction in the syllabus. We're going to talk about the fact that many academics and pundits and public officials have been asserting the existence of this crisis for a long time, and it certainly predated Donald Trump and those recent events that I was just reviewing for you. Trump recognized the conditions and used them to his own advantage, the opportunity to sort of stir up populist resentment, intolerance for outsiders, perceived threats to our way of life and our way of government, support for violence have always, but certainly in the last couple of decades, been out there and made it difficult to govern once you get into office. I think he used them, but he certainly didn't invent them. There's a fairly well-known book in my discipline of political science, 2 scholars, one at the American Enterprise Institute, the other at Brookings, which you will recognize maybe as one is sort of on the center right, one's on the center left. Their names are Norm Ornstein and Tom Mann. They've studied the Congress all of their lives. And they wrote a book published in 2012. They probably wrote it over 2010, 2011, published in 12. The title of the book is "It's Even Worse Than It Looks: How the American Constitutional System Collided with New Politics of Extremism." In the book, they started with what is really a case study. They talk about how difficult it is just to get the ordinary stuff done in Congress anymore, as of 2012 at that point. And so they start with a case study of the perennial question of increasing the nation's debt limit. And they note it's a totally unnecessary fight. It makes absolutely no sense in economic or fiscal sense. It's not a requirement of the Constitution. It's just a stupid law that the Congress passed decades ago. The money's been committed by the Congress and the president. The money is already legally spent. And so you got to raise the debt limit at some point to keep spending the money. And the money's got to be spent because the full faith and credit of the United States government is at risk. So you can't not do it. Everybody in Washington knows that. But if you fail to increase the minimum, you bring about number one, the shutdown of the government, which has happened fairly often and is threatened to happen even more often. The classic case when this all started was Newt Gingrich, after winning the midterms in 94, then challenged Bill Clinton in 95, 96, December of 95, January of 96, and they shut down the government. And we had a mess in Washington and some certain disruptions out in the bureaucracy in the rest of the country. But you can't do that very long. And if you did not increase the debt ceiling, you'd have a recession, you'd have an economic crisis, and our credibility and our T-bills would be a mess on the international markets. What it is simply political theater, as Ornstein and Mann point out. You've got to do the basic functions of government, and yet they now get clogged up. The debt ceiling demonstrates graphically how dysfunctional and how politicized this system has become. And it's important to note, as they do, no other country, certainly no Western democracy, does this. It's absolutely an American creation, and it's all about the politics of it. So let me get to where they go after the case study. Slide number 3, Gary, if you would. We believe a fundamental problem is the mismatch between the parliamentary style political parties, ideologically polarized, internally unified, vehemently oppositional, and politically strategic, that has emerged in recent years, and a separation of powers system that makes it extremely difficult for majorities to work their will. Students of comparative politics have demonstrated that the American policymaking system of checks and balances and separation of powers has more structural impediments to action than any other major democracy. Now, there are additional incentives for obstruction to the policymaking process. Let me go back and re-emphasize. The American policymaking system of checks and balances and separation of powers has more structural impediments to action than any other major democracy. Can we get things done? Can this democracy based in 17th century checks and balances, separation of powers actually work? Well, they published that now 10 years ago, and I'll guarantee you it has only gotten a lot worse in the 10 years since they published that. I'm going to shift now to Adam Schiff, not intended. Midnight in Washington, how we almost lost our democracy and still could, just out. Got it for Christmas. Santa Claus brought it to me. Now, I'll admit to you, if you know who Adam Schiff is, he's not a neutral observer. He's the chair of the House Intelligence Committee and was the leader of impeachment trial number 1 against Donald Trump. I'm plugging Adam Schiff mostly, I think. Well, number 1, his book's very relevant, and I've just finished it. But number 2, we're going to have him here, at least virtually, in the Paul Simon Institute series on March the 29th. If you want to hear him talk about all this stuff, I'll put in a plug for that series. It's an interesting book, and I'm sure you'll talk about that. Gary, for slide number 4, are you there?
I'm there.
Okay, great. He says, all around the world, there is a new competition between autocracy and democracy. And for more than a decade, the autocrats have been on the rise. This trend toward authoritarianism began before Donald Trump and will not have spent its force when he steps off the political stage for good. Now, I've been beating up on Donald Trump for a good while, and I want to throw in a bit on the other side. Donald Trump and his supporters and conservative folks of all different stripes will tell you that there is a crisis of democracy, but that crisis comes from the left and not the right. And I certainly acknowledge that that is a claim, and that is something that 75 million people probably believe. They cite the threats of predominantly urban violence on the heels of the George Floyd and Memorial Day 2020 problems that I talked about, the protest and the violence that followed his death in Minneapolis, and all of that was a spectacle. They talk about places like Seattle, Portland, which looked like a mess to me on television. I wouldn't have wanted to live downtown in either of those towns. St. Louis, Chicago, much closer at home. This was a major theme of the president's campaign at the time, as I mentioned. And he linked Black Lives Matter to Antifa, which stands for anti-fascism. Both of those, however, are not very well organized and not very clear in who they are and where they are. Maybe you should find that threatening, but the left is typically way more disorganized. And unfortunately, they don't get much done as a result of being disorganized the way they are. But there are really very serious problems in our urban areas, and of course, serious problems in our rural areas. But again, as I mentioned earlier, how will all this play out, particularly in the suburbs, and will the law and order campaign work both in Illinois elections and in the fall elections nationally? But we see the handwriting on the wall. This narrative is there. It will be the Republican and conservative response, and those ads are already out there, as I've mentioned. And there is serious debate in the academic literature, and certainly debate in the popular literature. And if you don't believe it, turn on Fox News and watch it for a while, and then turn over to MSNBC and watch it for a while, and you'll get a good sample of both. The serious academic thinkers, though, are the ones I'm going to try to deal with for the rest of this. And I would recommend 3 books to you that I want to mention. One is Robert Pape, P-A-P-E, a book entitled Political Violence. And I'm going to admit I've not gotten to this book yet. It was recommended to me by my friend Peril, who read it and told me I should read it. And he said it's an excellent source, but I'm taking Perry's word for it. There's a woman scholar, American, but lives in Europe mostly, named Anne Applebaum. She has a book entitled The Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism. And the one I'm going to mostly rely on here today is by Barbara Walter, published by Viking Press in 2021. And it's entitled How Civil Wars Start and How to Stop Them. And that brings me to slide number 5, Gary, if you would roll her up. Now it's Barbara Walter, not Walters, by the way. She is a major academic, and she has gotten enormous publicity in the academic world as well as the media world. I see her fairly often on TV talk shows, for example. And she was in the business of doing comparative research on violence and civil wars well before 2020. But then she elided that into a discussion of Trump and the Trump presidency. And she talks about the real danger now that she sees that we're on our way to a civil war. She says that these long-term trends, these long-standing grievances, these resentments have been with us, as I mentioned, and that Trump only magnified them and amplified them. She studied civil wars around the globe. She focused on the breakup of several major nations, Yugoslavia, which became Serbia, Croatia, and Bosnia and Macedonia, the strife in Northern Ireland that went on forever, the strife in Syria, which is still going on, the flip-flop from democracy back to authoritarianism in Myanmar or Burma. She studied all of those intently, and then she applied the lessons learned from those to where we are in the US today. And so that's where I am on slide 5, which is really dense and really maybe more than, can't tell. That projects maybe okay, doesn't it? That look okay? According to her, in these other nations and other civil wars around the world for a long time, there are some commonalities, there are some patterns, and that's what political scientists look for in comparative government. They look for the commonalities. And she says, number one, a country that is in a transitional and unsettled state where they could go authoritarian or adopt and keep a democracy is called an anarchy. And that's the most critical and the most shaky stage of development, or either going toward democracy on one end of the continuum or authoritarian rule on the other. And she maintains that we are in an anarchy, anocracy rather. Well, I have a hard time keeping those two words straight, anarchy and anocracy today. Now, I will add my editorial comments to these comments. I'm not sure I share that belief. That may be overdoing it just a bit for the argument's purpose. I'm not sure I believe that we've drifted that far down off the democratic end of the continuum, but she has a lot of statistics and does a lot of studies that support our indicators that really trend in those directions. Number two, a place where there's deep factionalism tends toward losing democracy or adopting autocracy. Conflicts among the world are internal battles more than anything, and they lead to civil wars. And they are conflicts among tribes, ethnic groups, religion, and regions. Well, we certainly have that. You can't argue that we don't have the deepest factionalism possible and maybe ever in the history of this country. It's interesting that Madison wrote eloquently in the Constitution about controlling faction as the #1 challenge, and Hamilton wrote about controlling factions. They'd be amazed at the factions we have now. And then number 3, she says, it's a question of these nations have political leaders who stir up fear of other group or the others. Editorial comment, I think we have a lot of that today. Now, let me give you the flavor of what she has analyzed and applied to us with those quotes at the bottom of the page in the second half of the slide. She says the guardrails or constraints on a president include checks and balances among government branches, a free press that demands accountability, and a fair and open political competition. Do you have those? Would-be autocrats put their political goals ahead of the needs of a healthy democracy, gaining support by exploiting citizen fears over jobs, over immigration, over security. They decry political leaders' compromises as ineffective and the government as a failure. How many times have you heard that theme about why people say they hate and distrust and are fed up with the government? Why do they want to vote in midterm elections to throw the rascals out? How many times have you heard people interviewed on television who said, I'm just going to vote against all the incumbents and throw them all out? Well, that's that quality right there. They decry political leaders' compromises as ineffective and the government as a failure. Do we understand the need of compromise in a checks and balances, separation of power system? Do we understand that the legislative process absolutely requires give and take and compromise, or it absolutely won't work. And you get the kind of gridlock that we've been all too accustomed to putting up with. She says on page 38, parties eschew politics go from being a system in which citizens care about the good of the country as a whole to one in which they care only about the members of their own groups. Walter says this is factionalism or identity politics, and that is what becomes the major driver for politics. Well, we've got a lot of that in the US, there's no doubt about it. Page 63, she says, people were especially likely to fight if they had once held power and saw it slipping away. I hear some of you murmuring, or we've heard a lot of that lately, haven't we? We once had power, but it all was getting away and they're taking over. What matters is that members of the group feel the loss of status to which they believe they are entitled to and are embittered as a result. Resentment and rage appeared to drive a faction to war. There is almost always a sense of injustice, a belief that whoever is in power doesn't deserve to be there. Whoever is in power doesn't deserve to be there. The election was stolen and the election was a fraud, and all elections have that problem if I don't win them. She does 5 chapters of standard comparative government, the kind of stuff my discipline does. She searches for examples across other nations, particularly those with civil wars and those with deep internal dissent. And she provides a wealth of empirical data. There are lots of huge international institutional data sets and big data crunchers who do this sort of thing. It's not what I do, although I like to think I do comparative state government in the same manner. But these generalizations really are instructive, I think. And then she gets down to applying it to us. She says, if you were an analyst in a foreign country looking at the events in America, the same way you would look at events in Ukraine, the Ivory Coast, or Venezuela, you would go down a checklist assessing each of the conditions that made civil war likely. And what you would find is that the United States, a democracy founded more than 2 centuries ago, has entered very dangerous territory. Well, that's a theme that lots of academic experts have picked up, let alone political leaders and people in the media who have talked about, are we on the verge of a civil war? How deep do our divisions go? I saw a cartoon yesterday, I think it was in The Economist, where they're talking about the United States divided, and they've got the outline of the sort of the US map, and right in the middle of it, there's a huge split, and it's just broken open right about the Mississippi River. And it was a great graphic, but I only saw it yesterday. I might have sent it to you, but think about that in your mind's eye, because that's the way The Economist summarized it in the newest version of what they've just put out. The stuff is out there. I do want to give you my perspective. You can take it for what it cost you, and you can consider it for what it's worth. And if you've got the interest, I'd certainly recommend Barbara Walter's book. I don't think the analogy with Civil War quite works for me, in the sense of we always think about the American Civil War and the unique nature of that does not fit the current context in this country and many others, but certainly some do. But anyway, the geography was different and the issue of slavery was different, because The geography was the geography of the South being a compact, contiguous district. And you don't have that today. Now you have the South as a deviant case, I say as a good Southerner, and always will be. I'd like that to go away one day, but it certainly hasn't. If anything, my friends and family down in South Arkansas are still fighting that Civil War, but nevertheless, that was different. And we had a bloody awful Civil War with somewhere between 690, 700,000 to 1 million people directly lost to that war. I'm looking at a Texan over there who understands this stuff, Dorothy. You know how that is in the South in places like Texas and Arkansas. But we don't have that neat division, and that makes this more limited as a discussion when you use Civil War per se, because our problems are divisions by party, ideology, and all of the states have lots of people on both sides of those questions. Now, some of them have 80% on one side and 20% on the other, but everybody has divisions internally if you take that geographical model, and they're all neatly summarized by party ID. Now, I'll give you that party ID is pretty sectional, but even that, you've got not a cohesive division in any way you can look at it geographically. The bigger division, in my estimation, is internal to places like Illinois. We love to hate and distrust Chicago. And lots of downstate does. And to run against Chicago, I came here 50 years ago when people were campaigning and running against Chicago, and it hasn't changed. I've been here half a century, and Southern Illinois hasn't. If anything, it's gotten worse running against Chicago. Surefire way to get elected to state legislature around here. Never mind to the Congress. But our divisions are pretty clear. They are Central City, Chicago, the suburban area, and downstate. We're not at all unique. There's a great book in political science by Catherine Kramer. We had her here speaking a couple of years ago, and she's written the story of Wisconsin. And Wisconsin's exactly the opposite from us geographically. That is, Wisconsin, the South is what they hate, and the downstate is upstate and everything north of Madison and Milwaukee. And Wisconsin's so divided. Any of you see 60 Minutes Sunday night? I know Beth said she saw it. It was about Wisconsin, and they're still fighting over the election and what they're going to do. And all the new rules and new laws they're passing up there, because half of the electorate and half of the representatives in Wisconsin haven't given up on the idea that Wisconsin actually voted for Donald Trump. And if you go to California or New York or all kinds of other places, there are those geographically based divisions, but there's still party and ideology and race and so forth, even more than or at least equal to the question of geography per se. I do think there are dangers here, however, and I do think there's a good probability that there will be more domestic insurrections on a smaller scale, perpetuated especially by these wacko militia groups that are out there. And there's a bunch of those out there, and in places that you might not expect, like Michigan and Wisconsin. They have these fools that are running around with their camo, carrying their AK-47s or whatever, playing soldier on the weekend or even during the week. And they take that stuff very, very seriously. I think it is mostly random and mostly uncoordinated, although I would say that social media make it easier to coordinate than ever before. So I'm not going to guarantee you just how uncoordinated it is. But the insurrections that have happened really are mostly by sort of catch-all, catch-can militia type groups. There was a good deal of coordination to the January 6th, getting them there, and the different groups are involved. And that's what's coming out of those hearings in the House Select Committee now on January 6th. So to the extent that stuff is coordinated through social media, I think is very unsettling. I think there's that whole division based on the resentment again, religion, race, region, federal government versus state government. But we're dependent on the laws being accepted and people not taking to the woods, not becoming militia people. And one of the problems we face right now is the division over how we're going to settle those disputes. You'll remember, I think, the question in Michigan. Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, was the target of one of these groups, and they had an active plan to kidnap her. And 12 of them, 14 of them were arrested, and 4 of them have been on trial last week and this week. And that's pretty serious stuff, because at least according to their rhetoric, they were talking about having a trial and then coded word maybe, but assassinating the governor. I don't know whether that would perpetuate a civil war or not. I think the question depends on how do the state authorities react, and basically how does the system at federal level and state level deal with people like that. And fortunately, in this case, Whitmer was spared, but it was a fairly close call. Yeah. And who knows what it would take to have a bunch more of those kinds of incidents. I think those kind of things are terribly concerning, because it gets back to that question of, are you going to use violence to attain your ends? And for a lot of people, the answer is yes. A lot of people don't have any qualms about saying, yes, we're going to use violence. And so I think there are some real concerns out there. But I think the question, again, these concerns are those that we typically settle with the electoral process. We vote, and we decide to move on after we vote, and we decide to accept the outcome. One of the major problems right now, though, is that polarization that seems to get worse rather than get better. And I think it's exacerbated by what I think, particularly for academics, is even a worse nightmare of a problem, and that is we have a long, difficult narrative going right now over what are facts. Is it a fact? Who won the presidency? How do you count votes, and how do those facts get tallied up? What is truth? What is reality? We can't even get on the same page on the narrative now, because we don't even live in the same universe of what are facts and how do you establish truth. There's a long tradition in the philosophy of science that covers all this in great depth. But we in universities think we talk about facts. We think we talk about how you establish what is true, what is reality. We talk about the scientific method, both in science naturally, but also in the social sciences. And what does that method require? And there are an awful lot of people in the world that don't accept that anymore. We talk about engineering and how do you build a bridge? It's got to be built on mathematics and physics, for crying out loud, and structural engineering, for crying out loud. And you can't debate about how those things work. Now, you might find some flaws in some bridges, but that's what we do in higher education. And I think that's why this is all so disconcerting from our standpoint, those of us that have been in the education world, because it is fundamentally about what we do, how do we establish facts, how do we establish truth? And that's what's really at stake here. I've got some more of this that is going into the public opinion polling, but I am going to take the prerogative of rolling the public opinion polling over, which would start with slide 6, which I don't want to do. And we'll save that for next week because I want to save some time as promised for our question and answer and feedback period. So this is a test case of how does that go? A chance for you to tell me I'm wrong or challenge me or talk about what you want to talk about or let me elaborate. So I'll take a breath and a shot of water and Gary, you're going to have to moderate with the people on the Zoom at this point. I invite all of you out there in Zoom land to send Gary your questions. Yes. Okay.
I'm sure it's been studied in other countries around the world where we've seen them have disputed elections. They don't agree. They have fights in the streets about the election. Then, as far as our media is concerned, it disappears. Do those type of situations resolve eventually?
Well, I think one important answer is what does the military do? Look at Burma, Myanmar, and what the military does and didn't do there. That's why I emphasized Mark Milley, because they're the people with the power in particularly the less developed world. And do the generals stay in the barracks or do they come out and run the government? They stayed in the barracks. Well, they ran the government for decades. Then they had a fledgling democracy. And then the generals came back. So that and the federal law enforcement people, all of that would have been relevant. FBI, what did they say? What did they do? U.S. Marshals, Trump wanted to use the U.S. Marshals in the cities, for example, in Seattle and Portland, for example. So people with guns and with real physical power often determine that. Sometimes there's enough of a rule of law in the courts that they will settle that. But if you don't have a functioning democracy, the rule of law is subject to whim. I mean, Putin's just decided that if you deviate from what the government's saying, you can go to jail for 15 years. And that stuff happens routinely in these countries that are in transition, particularly. So who controls the military? Who controls all those people with guns? Yes.
More locally, we see all these threats to the election people that work, like example, in this very room as election polling place. Do you foresee the military the day that for our next elections, the military having to be here to protect every single election site?
No, but it's a relevant question because a lot of those people were physically threatened. There have been countless physical threats against county clerks and election officials, and those threats still go on. What I do see is more activity by state legislatures trying to take over the process. I won't talk about that next week, actually, but that's basically one of the things that I think is very threatening in terms of how we've always conducted elections and whether or not state legislatures should take those over. And they are in some cases. I don't know. It depends on the circumstance, but yeah, we have pretty peaceful elections in Illinois generally, and around here we've always had that tradition, but it's still a terribly unsettling thing when secretaries of state, statewide officials, whoever's in charge, would be the State Board of Elections in Illinois, not Secretary of State. But all of those people have been put in harm's way in lots of different places. And I've participated in some of this. Those of you that have know it's hard enough to get election judges now, much less if you go wind up besieged like those down in Georgia wound up besieged. Yes.
Dr. Jackson, last week in the Washington Post was a really fascinating article, and it was that in reality, we have 4 political parties jammed into 2 parties. We have the far right and the far left, we have the more moderate. So there's 2 Democratic parties and 2 Republican parties, which add to the complication of trying to govern.
That's a very good point. I'll repeat this. I should have repeated those other 2 questions for folks out there. I doubt they can hear the question, can they?
It's on translation. They can see it.
Oh, okay. Well, the question of not 2 parties, but 4. That has always been true in a sense. James McGregor Burns wrote a classic book 60 years ago saying that was true then. I think it is terribly important now in terms of the distribution of those across the spectrum and how big is the far, how big is the left and how big is the right on the far ends of the reaches of both of those. And I think we're talking about how much do we now skew toward the tails of the distribution, basically. And Democrats are really, in some ways, the Democrats are worse off on this because they really have more diversity and the spread across opinion in the Democratic Party is greater. The Republicans, however, and this is going to be a theme I come back to again and again, the Republicans, I don't think that distribution overlays the exact distribution of the ideology involved, but I do think that it centers on the question of, are you for Donald Trump and his interpretation, or are you now wanting to move on? And that's where I think they've got their major problems. Lily, was it you? Someone over here had it? No, not Lily. Okay, someone, I saw another hand. Well, you got anything coming in that you want me to talk? They're all asleep out there in Zoom land, Beth and then Neil.
Do the militia kind of people recognize that they are promoting an authoritative kind of situation? And do they realize that that's what they're wanting? And could the thing that's going on in Ukraine with Putin change their hearts, make them see this isn't really a good system?
Well, point number one, or negative answer is yes, I think they do. And I think they like that because there's an admiration for authoritarian leaders. Point number two, I'd like to agree that they might learn from that and not like it, but I'm not that optimistic that they will see that as, there's been a good deal of talk on some parts of television about Putin's a guy we ought to be supporting in this fight. So there's this group called the Sovereign Nation Group, which is overlapping some of this. They've been around for a long time. They say, I'm sovereign. There is, you know, I make the rules and I don't recognize any authority. That's an extreme version. And that stuff's been out there a long time. This stuff used to sort of be summarized in the old days by the John Birch Society, who had a lot of this sort of thing. The Koch brothers' father, for example, was a leader of the John Birch Society. But John Birch Society, while I thought it was nuts, was fairly tame compared to some of the stuff that's out there now. Neil.
Well, not really a question. I think you hit on the last part, that the destruction of truth. What is truth? It is the symptom that is present now,
Yeah,
and it's being replaced by force and by power,
yeah.
which says truth is whatever I say.
Well, look at the
And the rest of us can operate.
look at the 1984 Orwellian steps that Putin is taking to control the media in Russia right now. Good night. I mean, those Russian people, particularly the ones out away from the urban areas where he is strongest, they get the party line. They get what Putin is saying this fight's all about. And it is 180 degrees from the reality. But that will be their reality, and that will be what they believe. And he's more and more squeezing down any of the alternate voices that you would get. You see that young TV person that rushed onto the national news set and held up the poster yesterday.
Yeah.
She's probably in a gulag somewhere.
Oh, yeah,
right
they
now.
picked her up.
Yeah.
They picked her up right away. Took her
Yeah.
to the police. Yeah.
So that's the scary part of this. They have to control all of that to the extent possible. And so far, I would guess a fair number of Russians are getting a fair amount of real information, but probably way more of them don't have access to what's really happening out there. And that's Orwellian kind of thing that I referred to. Yes, over here.
What are you seeing or get the feeling of among the campus population in terms of their belief of democracy? Do we have faith that the younger generation believes in democracy?
That's tough. I think symbolically, yes, and I think symbolically they do. And young people generally have pretty good inclinations and impulses, but I don't think they have much of a deep understanding of what that really means. I think I taught intro for a long time, and the range was great in those big monster intro sections that I taught. But like the American people in general, they don't understand all of this stuff about you got to accept the outcome of an election if you're going to have democracy that lasts. And some of that stuff, they don't know that, understand it. You talk in high school, I would guess you have a view on that too. I don't know about high school kids. I know you work at it, but
They're so far removed. They don't have enough experience in life yet
yeah,
to
that's a good
understand.
point. Yeah, young people generally have good impulses, but as they grow older, their impulses change and they are not always so generous when they get older, tolerant, I would say, when they get older. But yeah, that's a terribly important point. And I must say, having done this all those years, I think we've got a long way to go. Jan.
I'll just use this as an example to you. Yesterday, I had a conversation with a lovely young lady who is a counselor in an alternative high school in Lawrence, Kansas. And she was relating some of the problems that she has with her students that she tries to guide towards college. They say, I don't have to go to school, I'm dropping out. I'm going to be a YouTuber and make my money off of the ads that I get on my YouTube. And that's my future. Lord, it just about knocked me off my chair.
Yeah. I particularly dislike the job title of I'm an influencer
Yeah,
on
yeah,
social media. Tom Britton's cut out to be an influencer, but I wouldn't want to grow up to be an
Yeah, but I'm
influencer.
not cut out to be on YouTube.
yeah.
Yes,
Where does the funding comes from for all these militia groups and all? Is the funding from the United States within our country, or does it come from another country?
well, that's a very good question, and there's no clear answer. Number one, much of it's self-funded. That's what they do, and they don't mind spending their money on very expensive weapons and very expensive ammo. And all of that is the kind of fervor they have. There are, though, organizations out there in this so-called dark money world that funnel money, and some of them funnel money to the January 6th people, for example. So don't overlook the possibilities that that money is coming out of that network of funders. I wouldn't worry much about money coming from overseas. I'd worry about our money going there. For example, the studies of the truckers in Canada, more than half of that money came from the US. Canada's got a right to worry about us instead of us worrying about it coming across our borders. So there is organized money out there being placed around strategically. But again, it doesn't negate the fact that a lot of these people that's what they do. And, I'd like them to be a little less generous with some of the wacko things they support, but they probably wouldn't like some of the things they would consider wacko that I support. Let's see. Oh, yes.
The national debt, we're up to like $30 trillion
Yes.
on that, and then we got inflation now. How is all this going to play in the upcoming election?
Well, it's going to be huge, and it's going to be effectively used against the president, no question about it. And I'll save some of this for later, but we tend to think the president is in charge. The president's only very remotely in charge of the national economy. And yet everybody's being urged to vote against Joe Biden because they're mad about how much it costs to fill up your tank. And that's going to be a powerful message. And I thought that might go away until the Russian invasion, but that so exacerbated and upset the balance and so upset the world markets and so upset the question of energy prices that I'm not sure it'll go away now. So absolutely, crime may be number one, but it may be number one, or they're close for top two in terms of the issues. And, voting against somebody to cure your problems at the pump is a pretty blunt instrument, but people still are going to think of it that way.
Is there any limit to our national debt?
Yeah, the limit, I guess, in a very huge macroeconomic level analysis is how strong is our economy? And that's the only real limit to the national debt. And how much of the national debt is fueling inflation? That'll be a bone of great contention in the upcoming election. So you got your finger on an important addition. And I will maybe hopefully come back to that later on too. Anyone else? All right, well, I thank you all. I thank you folks out there in the Zoom world, and I hope to see you all back here. My classes at SIU, about 10% would usually go for the drop slip at this point. You don't even have to have a drop slip to drop the course, but I'd be glad to see you all back next week.